What's up everybody, I'm HoopsandHipHop, and get ready for some opinions. I don't know about you guys, but to me, Pokémon seems like one of the most opinionated video game franchises in terms of the fan base of all time. I think a lot of it has to do with the Pokémon themselves and everyone's different take on them, but even past that, a lot of people have a lot of different opinions about everything from the games to its features and so on. Each new Pokémon game introduces a lot of new stuff, and sometimes because of that, things can either go underlooked or overlooked, overappreciated or underappreciated, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The most overrated and underrated things from every single Pokémon generation. Now, obviously I won't be covering Generation 8 at this point because it's not out yet, maybe we'll make that a video for a later date, but for now I am going to cover every single generation that has been officially released, which means we've got a lot to cover and we need to go through it as quickly as possible so we're not here for like 5 hours, so why don't we go ahead and get right into it. Oh, and by the way, one more quick thing because I always forget to mention things in my intros. When I'm referring to the Pokémon generation, I'm specifically talking about the main sets of games in that generation. So for example, with Gen 3 you have Ruby and Sapphire, but then you also have Fire Red and Leaf Green. I am only going to be talking about the things that were introduced in Ruby and Sapphire because those are the titular titles of that generation. With that out of the way though, let's go ahead and officially get started. Okay, so starting with Generation 1 and Pokémon Red and Blue, the most underrated thing from this generation, in my own opinion, is the story of these games. Gen 1's story is a bit different compared to the other generations because it's not force-fed to you throughout the game. Rather, it's kind of broken up in bits and pieces that you have to go out and find yourself and then glue back together in order to get the bigger picture. And when you do get the bigger picture, you actually have a lot of really interesting things going on. There's obviously the whole Mewtwo side story where it was created on Cinnabar Island, but then it escaped to Cerulean Cave, and then you have Mr. Fuji from Lavender Town, who was formerly the Dr. Fuji that you learn about on Cinnabar Island, and you later kind of put together that the Cinnabar mansion that's abandoned was once his mansion, and he worked with Blaine, and there's just all this stuff going on, and you have to kind of figure it out yourself. The game doesn't tell you, and that's what makes the story of Gen 1 so awesome in my opinion. However, the most overrated thing in Gen 1, in my opinion, are the Pokémon. Now, this is probably a pretty predictable pick because everyone is always talking about how the Kanto Pokémon get the benefit of nostalgia and being the first ones to be introduced, and they were the ones that started it all, and so they really get a lot of the benefit of a lot of doubts when it comes to this sort of thing. However, when you judge them on a purely objective perspective, they're definitely not the greatest. I won't necessarily say they're the worst, but they definitely have a lot of negatives going for them, like the fact that there's a Seal Pokemon named Seal, for instance. And while I think it does deserve a little bit of an excuse from this type of criticism because it was the first generation, it kinda had to get its feet under itself before Pokemon could really grow into its own, it still definitely leaves a lot to be desired in terms of the greatest Pokemon of all time. Moving on to Generation 2 and Gold, Silver, and Crystal, we have the most underrated thing from these games, which I believe is the Apricorn Pokeball crafting system. But when you think about it, this system was actually awesome because it was actually a legit RPG crafting system, even if it was pretty basic, within a Pokemon game, and thinking about that in today's day and age is just absolutely mind-blowing because it's not the kind of super in-depth RPG type experience that you would expect to see in a Pokemon game. And before a bunch of different types of Pokeballs was the norm for the franchise, going out and finding these Apricorns to see what kind of Pokeball you could create was so fascinating the first time around, especially because the internet wasn't a big thing at that time, so it couldn't spoil it, and it was just a really nice side questy type of thing that you could really get invested in while playing through the main story at the same time. However, even though the Johto-based games are my favorite, one thing that I think is really overrated, and I'm probably going to catch some flack for this, is the entire game of Pokémon Crystal. Now, I've touched on it briefly in the past, but I've always kind of resented the Pokémon Crystal game just because I didn't really feel like Suicune was deserving of the title of a box art legendary Pokémon. Sure, it introduced some definite improvements like being able to choose a female player character, and it introduced things like moving sprites and different things like that that have now become standard for the Pokemon franchise, but there's also the fact that Pokemon Crystal effectively ripped Suicune out of the role that it was built for in being a legendary trio type of Pokemon, along with Entei and Raikou, and also being a roaming legendary, and it was kind of thrust into this titular box art legendary role that it was not built for, and I kind of think it did a disservice to the Pokemon, and especially its other two counterparts, and kind of put things a little out of balance and out of place. And other than those few things that I just mentioned, the game is basically the same as Gold and Silver, so to say it's monumentally better than its other two counterparts is just honestly not true, and once again, I know I'm probably gonna get some hate for that, but that's personally how I feel. And now we move on to Generation 3 Ruby and Sapphire, and the most underrated thing from these games, I believe, are the secret bases. When talking about things that the Gen 3 games introduced, you probably think of things like wild battles, abilities, and natures, but secret bases is probably not going to be one of the things you think of immediately when discussing this topic. However, in my opinion, it deserves as much recognition as anything that was introduced in Gen 3 because it's just so awesome. Basically, you can build your own house inside of a wall, inside of a tree, inside of a giant bush, and then you can completely furnish it and decorate it to your liking. It's more or less a little slice of Animal Crossing inside of a Pokemon game, and if that combination is not a match made in heaven, I don't know what is. Okay, if you guys are ready for another opinion that might make some people angry, well, I have got just the thing for you, because I personally believe the most overrated thing about the Generation 3 games is the Battle Frontier. Now, I know pretty much everyone loves the Battle Frontier, but for me personally, it was just not my cup of tea at all. Don't get me wrong, I think it was awesome that they added this area to Pokemon Emerald and gave that game a nice post-game activity for people to get invested in, but personally it just doesn't do anything for me. I've never really been a fan of battle facilities because I really hate the fact that they flatline your Pokemon's level and prevent your Pokemon from learning experience, which in my mind takes all of the reasoning for battling Pokemon out of the Pokemon battles themselves. Now, I know there are people who are competitive battlers who enjoy battling for the sake of battling. Once again, I'm not that person, so obviously I'm going to feel differently, but for the most part, when people are battling competitively, they are doing it against other real people. So not only are you not gaining experience from these battles, but from a competitive perspective, you're not even getting the satisfaction of beating a real person because you're just fighting against the computer. So I really saw no benefit to these types of battles at the time, which is why I personally believe the Battle Frontier is overrated. Moving on to Gen 4, the literal definition of something that's underrated is something that almost no one talks about anymore, and that is the dual slot mode dongle method from Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if some of you don't know what this is because once again, literally no one talks about it, but basically if you are playing on a DS that has a Game Boy Advance slot and you're playing Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, you can put in any of the Gen 3 Game Boy Advance Pokemon games, and this allows you to catch different kinds of Pokemon in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum that you wouldn't normally be able to, and some of them are rare Pokemon like Elekid and Magby, for instance. Now, the reason why I think this is so underrated is because it increases the variety of Pokemon you can catch in a really cool and unique way, and it even gives you some really rare Pokemon like the previously mentioned Elekid and Magby that you normally wouldn't be able to catch in those games or pretty much in any game because for the most part they're either trade exclusive or breeding exclusive and just cannot be found in the wild. Moving on though, the most overrated part of the Gen 4 games in my opinion is the soundtrack. Now once again, this might be kind of a strong opinion, but the soundtrack of the Gen 4 games just never really appealed to me at all. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the soundtrack is bad because it's definitely solid and has some great themes, but the overall slower jazz type of style that most of the tracks have in the Sinnoh region is just not my cup of tea in any way, shape, or form, and a lot of the popular tracks from these games, like Jubilife City for instance, I've never really been a fan of at all despite the hype because once again, the style of music in Gen 4's soundtrack is just not my personal favorite. Moving on to arguably the most controversial generation, we have Generation 5, and the most underrated thing I think comes out of these games is the Seasons feature. Just the way that Generation 2 introduced a day and night cycle and Generation 3 introduced weather, Generation 5 introduced the concept of seasons, and I really think this did so much to really bring the region alive, but I just think it kind of went underused in terms of the potential that it had. Sure, it made the region look and feel differently on the outside, but in terms of an actual function, it really didn't do a whole lot. For instance, there was really only one set of Pokemon that took advantage of the Seasons feature, that being the Sawsbuck line, but out of that and out of their forms changing because of it, nothing was really done in terms of the Pokemon themselves to take advantage of this awesome feature. I just think there's a lot more potential for the Seasons feature that could be built upon, but given the fact, like I said, that it was underused in Generation 5 and hasn't been seen since, definitely makes it one of the most underrated things from those games. Alright, here we go. If you have not been offended by one of my strong opinions at this point, this might just take the cake for you, because I believe the most overrated thing about Generation 5 is the story. Ever since Pokemon Black and White were released, the story of these games has been hailed as easily the best in the series, and many people still think that to be true even with 2 more generations under our belts. And even though the story of Generation 5 was much more serious compared to other generations, and I will say was better compared to some other generations, I really don't think it's all that cracked up to be in terms of being this amazing, just awesome, unbelievable story that some people make it out to be. This is because the story of Generation 5 just doesn't really do anything that a great story in my mind would normally do, and that would be things like leaving me on the edge of my seat, blowing me away with crazy plot twists, and just really investing me into it to the point where I have to know more, and I have to know more now. Great for Pokemon standards, maybe, but great in general, I don't think so. Now we move on to Generation 6 and Pokemon X and Y, and the most underrated thing about this generation would be the games Pokemon X and Y themselves. Nowadays, for one reason or another, a lot of people seem to write off these games or simply overlook them altogether. I personally believe it has to do with the fact that these games are somewhat easy and get heavily criticized for that, but outside of that, these games are simply phenomenal in every way, shape, and form. The region was one of the most culturally rich regions that we have ever seen. The Pokemon that were introduced in this region, even though there were few of them, were fantastic. We got the incredible feature of Mega Evolution, and then we also got additional features that were also amazing, like the PSS system, the Friend Safari that allowed you to catch rare Pokemon and even starter Pokemon, and I could just go on and on about how good these games are and how many great things they brought to the Pokemon franchise. And even though I absolutely love these games, I did have to pick something that was overrated about them, and one thing I think is overrated is the graphics. At the time of their release, a huge deal was made about the graphics of these games because, of course, these were the very first Pokemon games in 3D, well, at least for the main series anyway. And even though this was amazing to see, and it was definitely groundbreaking for Pokemon as a franchise, when you take a look at it objectively, it really isn't that great of an accomplishment. Number one, these games came out in 2013. 2013, and we were just getting our very first main series 3D Pokemon game, when the rest of the industry was literally light years ahead of them at that time. Number 2, the graphics themselves are just not that great to look at. Granted, yes, they are 3D, and once again, they are on the 3DS, which is a bit underpowered compared to, obviously, home consoles, but when you look at these games and just look at their overall visual appeal, I personally believe that the Gen 5, Gen 4, even Gen 3 era is more visually satisfying, even though those games are in 2D, because even though these games are in the superior 3D, I just don't think those 3D graphics look clean enough in X and Y to really be aesthetically pleasing. And moving on to our final officially released generation at this point, we have Generation 7, and the most underrated part of these games in my mind is the story. Now personally, I think the story of these games is phenomenal, and I definitely prefer it over the fan favorite Gen 5 story. However, I think it's underrated because a key criticism of these games is that there were just way too many cutscenes. Now, while I am certainly not a fan of games essentially becoming movies because of their excessive amount of cutscenes, I don't think Sun and Moon did that at all. I think it had the right balance of a good amount of cutscenes in order to be able to tell a good story, which is required because you can't really tell a story in gameplay, at least not a great one. But then at the same time, it wasn't really so much that you were basically watching a movie like so many other games seem to do in the modern gaming industry. Now, I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me, and I will agree that at least having the option to skip those cutscenes if you wanted would have been a nice balance between the two, but the fact of the matter is if you are going to have a great story in Pokemon like so many people want, you're going to need cutscenes to accomplish that, and I believe the cutscenes did a great job of delivering a great story in these games and were not unnecessary or excessive at all. And finally, the most overrated thing about the Generation 7 games, in my own mind, is the games themselves. I know that in the 3 years since these games have been released, a lot of people have come back down to earth as far as their overall hype and impressions of the game, and they definitely have received their fair share of criticisms, but I do remember shortly after the games were released that everyone was talking about these games as if they were the greatest Pokemon games of all time, and straight up, that is just not true at all. There's also the fact that Game Freak showed off way too much of this game before it was actually released, which definitely hurt the overall enjoyability that we could have had we not known so much about the game prior to playing it for the first time. So overall, even though these games are not bad, I felt like they got way too much credit, especially in the early days following their release, and overall, I felt like they left a ton to be desired. And there we have it, everybody. Those were the most overrated and underrated things from every Pokemon generation to this point, in my own opinion. Now, I'm sure you guys are definitely going to have your own opinions as well, so be sure to leave those in the comments below. If you disagree with me, that's fine. Just be respectful about the way that you state your opinion and your reactions. But if you did enjoy this video as well, be sure to give it a like because it really helps out. And once again, leave all your thoughts in the comments below. If you guys are new to the channel, be sure to subscribe for more new Pokemon content every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. And if you would like to directly support the channel further, definitely check me out on Spotify and listen to some of my Pokemon remixes, because that is a really easy way to directly support the channel, and it helps me make videos just like this for you guys, so it certainly helps a lot, and I would greatly appreciate it. With all that being said though, I will be back on Tuesday for another video, so be sure to hit that notification bell so you can be notified as soon as it goes live, and until then, as always, I hope you know I love you guys very much, and until the next one, as always, I will smell you guys later.